Welcome to History at the OK Corral. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, leave us a comment down below, and share this episode with a fellow history lover. And now, on to tonight's episode. South Kingston, Rhode Island, December 19th, 1675. Just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, an army of over 1,000 Puritan English settlers with more than 150 Mohegan and Pequot allies marched through whipping winds and snowfall across an ice-encrusted swamp towards a fortification of thousands of Narragansett warriors, tribal elders, women, and children under the leadership of their sachem, Conunchet, who English leaders would refer to as a most perfidious villain. The contrasting civilizations were on the precipice of one of the most horrific scenes to take place in all of King Philip's War. But first, how did it come to this? June 20th, 1675. On this day, Philip, otherwise known as Metacom, a Pokanoet chief and sachem from the Wampanoag people, began a bloody and barbarous conflict between a coalition of native tribes loosely assembled under his vision against the New England Confederation, comprised of the Puritan colonies of Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and New Haven. The Puritan colonies had adopted this confederacy to create a defensive force against the Dutch colony of New Netherlands, as well as the native tribes of the Northeast region. Philip had come into power after the death of his father Massasoit in 1662. While Massasoit and his people had a relatively peaceful relationship with the settlers, assisting them, trading, and cohabitating the land, Philip's reign would mark a decidedly different approach. The crux of this change in diplomatic relationships can be traced to the treaty proffered by the colonists to the natives in 1671, which included the conditional surrender of all native arms. The English settlers sought to expand their security and dominion over an area in which they were vastly outnumbered through these escalating demands built into their treaties. The terms had damaged the relations between the sides, and the forcing function would finally occur in the spring of 1675, when 3 Wampanoags were hanged in Plymouth for the murder of a member of their own tribe. Hostilities would officially commence one fateful day in late June, a date tribally significant due to the summer solstice, when a band of Pokanoets raided several rural homesteads in Swansea in the Plymouth Colony of what is now present-day Massachusetts. These attacks would continue for months, with fierce fighting amongst colonists and natives taking place, as atrocities were committed as acts of retribution from one side to another again and again. The New England colonies would draft an ever-increasing contingent of men into service for the defense of their interest, and would align themselves with Mohegan, Mohawk, and Pequot natives. In October of 1675, Massachusetts Bay Colony held a diplomatic meeting with Conunchet, the sachem of the Narragansett tribe, and they signed the, quote, Treaty of Neutrality. The tribe had sought to remain impartial during the conflict. However, repeated visits from Pequot sachems who endeavored to gain the involvement of Narragansett warriors in the war and their precariously close location to Puritan settlements brought great angst and uncertainty to the colonists living amongst them. In early November, Governor Josiah Winslow would lead a contingent of Plymouth, Massachusetts, and Connecticut militia against the Narragansett tribe, burning their villages as they marched through Rhode Island, driving the Narragansett east towards the shore. The Narragansett had been found to be harboring refugees from the belligerent Wampanoag tribe of what is today eastern Rhode Island, and the colonists demanded they be turned over to them. After several rounds of start and stop deliberations, the Narragansett ultimately declined the colonists' request. Stonewall John, the Narragansett leader, then broke off peaceful negotiations with the colonials. His name, ironically, did not come from his style of diplomacy, but rather his incredible skill as a mason. On December 15th, after the dissolution of treaty talks, the Narragansett attacked the Giray Bull blockhouse, a fortification constructed of stone. 15 soldiers who were defending the fort would perish in the attack. 3 days later, on December 18th, the night before the Great Swamp Fight, had arrived. It was a cold, bleak, and snowy night. Divisions from Massachusetts, Plymouth, and Connecticut of the New England Confederation joined together at Petaquamskin, below Tower Hill, near the water's edge. The Massachusetts and Plymouth units marched through Richard Smith's trading post upon the way, using the harbor that was there to mobilize food, munitions, and supplies for the campaign. The Massachusetts counted 500 men, including a cavalry of 70 mounted soldiers. The Plymouth counted 150 men. The Connecticut added 300 Englishmen along with 150 Pequot and Mohican native auxiliaries. This substantial force of more than 1,000 was not made up of pacifist settlers. It was a hardened band of men who had seen vicious combat, some of which was gained during previous battles during the still young King Philip's War. The force also included veterans of the astonishingly fatal English Civil War. Narragansett scouts had made the presence of this mobilizing force known to their people. They also reported that it was growing in number and positioned dangerously close. It was made clear to the Narragansett that the mission of the New Englanders was to ratify a treaty with the Narragansett that would keep them out of King Philip's War. The people of Rhode Island, aware of the bloodshed that had been taking place throughout New England in this conflict, became increasingly uneasy about the large Narragansett population so close to theirs. While small skirmishes had taken place amongst the New England companies and the Narragansett, they would pale in comparison to the coming Great Swamp Fight. The critical intel needed by the New England militia to take action was the exact location of the Narragansett. While at Wickford, Rhode Island, a small settlement in North Kingston, the English captured and interrogated a Narragansett native. Under threat of death, the Narragansett revealed the whereabouts of his people. The Narragansett believed swamps made for ideal locations to take up defensive positions. With their natural conditions designed to bog down an advancing force, they had built a fortification within the Great Swamp near South Kingston, Rhode Island, south of Narragansett Bay. Just before dawn on December 19th, a bitterly cold morning, the colonial force made their way to the Great Swamp, led through the snow by the Narragansett saboteur who had informed them of the location under the threat of execution. Had the scout not led them through, it would have been nearly impossible for the New England regiments to come upon the site of the Great Swamp fortification. Through the early hours of the day, the men marched over Tower Hill, across the Chappaqua River, heading for the Great Swamp. The conditions were so frigid that several of the men began to freeze, and had to be carried back to the site of their encampment. While the inclement conditions were a hindrance to the men on their journey, they would play a fateful role in allowing them to cross the Great Swamp, as the frozen march allowed them to travel with comparative ease to the conditions of the locale throughout the rest of the year. The discovery of the swamp being frozen lifted the spirits of the men and shifted the strategy to that of one of immediacy, accompanied by a more aggressive tone. Narragansett scouts opened fire upon the men as they spotted them in the woods near the swamp. Several skirmishes broke out, and the New Englanders fought their way to the opening of the Great Swamp. The men finally laid their eyes on the fortification. Large, upright cedar posts anchored the structure, reinforced with banks of clay brushed up into the timber like grout. Just in front of the fort were piles of brush stacked up as a breastwork, and large trees laid end to end. Captain Moseley and his Massachusetts company were in the front of the column, and rushed after the retreating Narragansett scouts, pursuing them to the opening of the fort. The Massachusetts men were met with a resounding fire from the entrenched Narragansett's flintlock muskets, which were used with lethal accuracy, as well as torrents of oncoming arrows. Fierce fighting continued, and the militiamen from the Old Bay State took heavy casualties as they drove forward into the endless fire of the warriors. The men were driven back into the swamp, and Captain Moseley, who was known to the warriors from previous engagements, would tell the governor after the assault that he saw 50 warriors aim at him through the course of the battle. Governor Winslow, the acting general of this colonial force, ordered the Connecticut to charge forward and support the pummeled Massachusetts column. A narrow opening in the front of the fort was the target of the advancing colonials, with it viewed as the weak point by the men as they locked eyes on the fort. It had in front of it a single large tree, laid on its side as a blockade, but the tree held little efficacy in stopping the English from getting to the front of the structure. Amidst the blistering pace of action that had now overtaken the once serene winter terrain, the fighting moved in around a series of tightly placed wigwams. It was ordered that the wigwams be set ablaze, causing several Narragansett people, including women and children, to be driven out by the flames and shot dead by Puritan muskets. The battle could have been lost for New England had the Narragansett not run out of gunpowder, sparking a dramatic shift in the course of the battle. After this, it was inevitable that the colonials would overcome the native attempts to repulse them. As dusk arrived, after an argument amongst the English colonists, with some calling to camp outside the structure and wait for daybreak, it was determined that they would set fire to the fortification. The densely populated fortification went up in a roaring symphony of flames, illuminating the evening sky as the scorching fire consumed the lives of many of the women, children, and elderly who inhabited the fortress. The vast majority of the tribe's winter supplies were also destroyed in the attack. Many of the Narragansett warriors had given up their positions and fled from the scene when the battle appeared lost, trekking through the woods long before the fire had been set. After the destruction of the fort, the surviving Narragansett people were also in the woods surrounding the icy swamp, and the English sought to make an escape into the cold and dark landscape before an attack could be delivered upon them by the reorganizing warriors. Hundreds of the Narragansett wounded, warrior and civilian alike, died in the piercing conditions in the woods surrounding the swamp. The sachem, who was within the Narragansett tribe, returned the following day and buried all of the dead. First-hand accounts of the number of Narragansett women and children killed range from 100 to 150, while some historical accounts deduce it would have reached into the several hundreds when all was said and done. The English took as many of their dead as they could carry back to Wickford. The men they couldn't carry were left on the ground, and the sachem of the Narragansett would do the work of burying them as well. The colonists would lose many of their officers during the siege, with roughly 70 men killed in total, and another 150 wounded. Unsurprisingly, the Massachusetts Regiment took the brunt of the casualties. The dead and wounded would be evacuated from Wickford to Aquidneck Island, a settlement in Narragansett Bay, where they would be looked after by Rhode Island colonists. The exact location of the Great Swamp Fortress remains disputed amongst archaeologists and historians to this day, with just a simple obelisk statue now acknowledging what transpired. Many have spoken of an unnerving, supernatural presence that can be felt on visits to the desolate location where hundreds were slain and buried throughout the swamp. For many years after the events, bones were visibly protruding through the soft, misshapen earth, painting a macabre landscape to serve as a grisly reminder of the events that took place there 3.5 centuries ago, and nearly brought a people to an end. The following spring, a vicious counteroffensive orchestrated by Canonchet would be launched, with over 2,000 natives from a multitude of tribal denominations. It would engulf the Rhode Island capital of Providence in flames and escalate the diabolical conflict even further. But for tonight, that, along with the other many unnerving tales of King Philip's War, are other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the Join button or click the link in the description below to become a member on Patreon. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.